My Tahoe, I got 325,000 miles on her now. And I don't know how much more miles she gonna make it. But I come packing with everything I need. And I tell anybody who ride with me, push the junk over and just get in. And I promise you, I'll get you to the polling place and get you back. And that is what I strive to do. Hey girl, how are you? I do this to make things just a little bit better. And I get real passionate about what I do when I do about the voting process. Because if you don't vote, you don't have a voice. There's a lot of history here. The Civil Rights Movement trail from Selma to Montgomery is here. I only live 5 miles off the trail. My family grew up here in Lowndes County on a sharecropper farm. And I can remember growing up, you went to school 3 hours out of a day and you had to go back to the cotton field and pick cotton until the sun down. I never forget, it was these 2 elderly ladies that every time a person turned 18 years old out of this public school system, those 2 ladies would make sure that they took their part and they did their part to make sure Black people had their right to vote by registering them to vote. Hello, how are you?
Miss Hardy was around when African Americans could not exercise their right to vote. And so she remembers what that was like. And to see people now that have the opportunity but don't choose to exercise that right, that's discouraging. And she takes it upon herself to try to ensure that everybody that has the legal right to vote exercises that right.
Let us march on ballot boxes until race baiters disappear from the political arena.
Remember the people that lost their lives, for us to have this opportunity.
To be detrimental to your safety to continue this march.
And some of those images still in my memory bank as of today, when I saw the struggle that Black people went through to get this opportunity to exercise that right.
And so invariably, every election cycle, Miss Hardy is traveling the back roads of Lowndes County. She's out knocking on doors. She's going to pick people up to make sure that they are getting registered to vote.
I know all my voters, so you can be black, white, blue, or brown, it doesn't matter. Just since you vote. What I do, it comes from here. And I serve it out here. I do it for a passion. Because this is who Perman Hardy is. This is what gonna make things a little bit better for my community, my county, my state.
Miss Hardy, she wants to see Lowndes County grow. She wants to see the best in Lowndes County. She's seen the good and the bad, so she's working for the good.
My oldest grandson just turned 18 years old, so I'm going to turn his app in. This will be his first time becoming a registered voter.
Yep, we got everything we need.
This is what it's all about. In order for better health care, you have to vote. Better school, you have to vote, because all this plays its part. Go and cast that vote. That power that you have is in that vote. And I stress that. I stress it all the time.
Hi, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining the series today. Hey, come on in. Good afternoon, evening, wherever you are. Hello. Thank you all for joining us tonight for the People Power Training Series. As you're starting to filter in and people are joining us from around the country, let's get to know one another. So please type in your first name, pronouns, where you're calling or viewing this training from. and one person who inspires you to do this work. Okay. Again, what's your first name? Is a pop quiz. What's your first name? What are your pronouns? Where are you viewing this training from? And one person who inspired you to do this work. So I will start and then pass over to my colleagues. My name is Chris Percy. I am the training director here at MoveOn. My pronouns are he, him. And I hail from the west side of Chicago, west side. The person who inspires me to do the work that I do, I have to think about my mother, and it's sort of cheesy, but my mother has really was the inspiration for all this work that I do, really working to empower people to not only live their best lives, but to keep up the fight to live their best lives. My mother passed away some years ago, but her spirit and her energy still fuel me in this work that I do. And so I bring that to this space, and I bring that to all of you. So make sure you're in the chat sharing where you're from, who you are, and who inspired you to do this work. I want to turn it over to my colleague Kenia to introduce herself and tell us who inspired her.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Kenia Leon, and I'm coming to you live from Las Vegas, Nevada. My pronouns are she, her, ella. And who inspires me to do this work is also the memory of my father, being a refugee from Cuba and literally coming to this country to fight for just rights and democracy. So thank you all for being here, and I'm going to pass it on to my colleague Sonia to introduce herself.
Hi everyone, my name is Sonia Torres Rodríguez. I'm originally from Puerto Rico, excuse me. A little bit of Texas came out. I'm also from Texas. I use she, they, ella pronouns. For those of you who need a visual description, I'm wearing my glasses today. I had my headphones on. I have a wall that hopefully will have art behind me soon, TV, a black t-shirt on, red lipstick. Who inspires me? It's a really good question. A lot of people, but I think I have to say today my grandmother. She has always valued kind of education for me and my siblings, and despite only having a second grade education, has always pushed us to do the best. So I think she's the one who I draw inspiration from.
Thank you, Sonia. So if you haven't shared, again, in the chat, share your first name, where you're viewing this call from, your pronouns, and that person who inspired you to do the work that you're doing today. And you're gonna understand why I asked that question later on in the training. But please just go ahead and just share with one another. This is community. This is time for us to get to know one another. And this time of COVID, we are all over the place, and we're having to be in our individual homes. I am here in front of my little botanical garden, as I call it. One, to disguise from the fact that my apartment is a mess. Two, because I like flowers. But like, we're all in these different places. So take time and get to know one another in the chat. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Kenia to ground us in this space.
Thank you, Chris. So speaking of where we are, I'd like to take a moment and acknowledge the land that I'm currently occupying in Las Vegas, Nevada. This is Paiute tribal land, and I just want to take a moment to honor them. And in the chat, feel free to share what native land you occupy. And if you're not sure, our amazing chat moderators will send you a link as well so you could figure that out. It's always important to honor the space that we're in, and we just want to start with that. Additionally, the times that we're in are also very chaotic. I want to take a moment to honor Jacob Blake and his family, and just the struggles that have happened this week that we keep seeing amplified. So just take a moment for that and honor him and his family. So I want to thank everyone for being here. I want to welcome everyone, welcome all people, all identities and feelings into this brave and safe space. This is a space of learning, of patience, and of curiosity. I also welcome your boredom, your righteous indignation, your anger, grief, joy, determination, and definitely your passion. We want to welcome those who are new to MoveOn and those who've been in the fight with us for a while. Want to acknowledge and welcome the people that have been touched by COVID-19 in any way, folks who are surviving, thriving, and folks who might just be holding it together for today. I want to welcome all identities, backgrounds, ethnicities, abilities, and those of all ages. Those who might feel comfortable with this technology, those who might be nervous, and those who tried really hard to resist it. I want to welcome those who made it possible for us to be here, our caregivers, our beloveds, and also respect and uplift our ancestors, the voices of the people who got us here. So with that, I want to welcome everyone here with us today who's ready to support and empower your community in any way possible. Thank you for being here. And to those who might be coming a little bit later, we welcome you too. And I will turn it back over to Chris to center us about today's training.
All right. Thank you so much, Kenia. All right, we got work to do, y'all. So I'm so excited, ready, and anxious to get digging in. So let's start the work. If you have been along this journey with us for the last couple of weeks, well, more than a couple of weeks. Oh my God, it's been like 4 weeks. If you have been along this journey with us, you know that we have dedicated this People Power training series to the life and the legacy of the late, great, amazing John Lewis, right? He is somebody who has fought so hard throughout his whole entire life to make sure that we had the right to vote, that we have equal rights, that we all have a fair share and shake in this country and life. So it is in that spirit of his life that we bring this training series to you. The quote for this week is, "History tells us that we must never give up, that we must never give in or out, that we must not get lost in the sea of despair, that we must keep the faith, that we must keep our eye on the prize, because together we can redeem the soul of our nation." So this is so fitting for today's training, because some of the work that we're going to be doing today is actually digging into the history of where we are today, right? Like we're dealing with all these things and like, where did this come from? And some of you might be like, oh, well, I know that because I've been here and I lived through it. I appreciate your space and you being here. And I invite you to sit there in that and still join us, still learn, because I have been through many a thing. And then when I sat down to research and learn about it, I was like, oh, I missed that completely. So please join us in this space and really sit to yourself and really think about the life and legacy of John Lewis. If you don't know John Lewis intimately, please research this man, because he is somebody who is truly amazing to the life and the work of civil rights in this country. Next slide. So for those of you who have been here before, give me one quick second to welcome those who have not been here before. So, and you might be like, well, what is this? What is this program that we're talking about, the Mobilize to Win program? I'm glad you asked. Again, if you've been here before and you're like, I already know what this program is, just give me 1 minute, because I want to talk to the folks who just joined us for the first time. So for those of you who are new and want to know about Mobilize to Win program, here's a brief overview of what this is. This program is a campaign that we are in now, hoping to engage tens of thousands of people across the United States to vote in this election and beyond, right? Because it's not just about this election, it's about moving forward and being involved in elections and marches and everything moving forward. We are empowering each other to support at least 10 people in our network, whether they be family, friends, whether they be your cousin, sister, baby, daddy, I don't care who they are, whoever it is that you know, we are trying to get everybody we know to vote, okay, because it is important. So we are getting at least 10 people to form a vote team, and you as the vote mobilizer will help navigate them through the process of voting. Now, to be clear, on the graphic that you see certain states highlighted. Those certain states are highlighted because they're battleground states. So if you know people in those highlighted states, those are the priority people that you want to go after. But if you know people who don't live in those states and you don't need to vote, you need to touch them too, right? So the only reason why those states are highlighted is because they are super important and they are battleground states, and we want to make sure that we get folks out, and it's super important. So, like, we have a lot of resources set up to make sure that this process is easy for you. If you were on our previous trainings, you know that we have a friend mapping guide. There's a guide to help you figure out who those 10 people are in your circle that you should reach out to, the folks that you know that you can move to vote. So you can learn about that on our website, how to effectively communicate about voting. We started that in the last training, and we're going to be talking about that even more today. How to tell your personal story to organize your friends to vote. This is something that is the most important tool in any organizer's toolbox, how to tell your story, because, you know, there's all kinds of issues that happen, and the thing that really moves people is really personal stories, like how do you relate to people. So you can sign up at mobilizetowin.org. You'll get access to all of our tools, our materials, and even learn how to be connected with other people around the country. It is a super dope program, and you get to join us on these trainings. And I am super excited about them because our trainings are really dope. I get made fun of because I like to say trainings are dope. But yeah, they really are great trainings. And we really are doing the work to support you through this process. If you're somebody who says, like, you know what, I don't have quite that much time to like find 10 people and do all that stuff, that is fine. If you take out your cell phone, or if you don't have it with you, you can write this down. If you text the phrase "we got us" to 668366, again, "we got us" to 668366, then we will make sure that if you text us that, we will figure out who those 3 people are that you want to make sure you get. And all you have to do is tell us their first name, and we will remind you to remind them to take their behind out there and vote, right? So again, you can type 668366, and you just type in "we got us," and you can get all that good information, okay? So I'm really excited about this program. It's really great. And one of the biggest pluses of the program to me is this training series, because we get to go deep on how to have these conversations and really getting into the weeds of the work, okay? That being said, let's get into the weeds of the work. Next slide. So the People Power Training Series will provide us a space to come together to be inspired, to learn, to challenge our assumptions, to strategize, and to plan tactics to honor the history of our communities and to actualize our voting power. I said this before, we are taking a more nuanced, equitable approach to traditional get out the vote training. So if you are somebody who says, I know this already, this training is for you. Because one thing that I know is whenever I talk to folks who start saying they know it all, those are folks who don't know it. You can challenge me on that later, put it in the chat. Take time now. If you're like, I already know this, I already know how to have conversations, I've been around the block, I honor you and your space and what you bring to this world. Now go ahead and sit down and pull out your pen and paper and get ready to learn, because it's still learning. If you're breathing, you can learn, all right? So take time, center yourself. If you have questions, go ahead and make sure and put it in the chat. Let's talk about it. If you disagree with something, that's fine. We are here to suss out stuff. Put that in the chat too. But this is for you. And if you think, please hear me as I say this. If you're saying to yourself, this is not for me, I'm saying to you, yes, it is. All right. Thank you so much. Now, we want to take you through a journey in these 3 trainings that we've been doing. We're on the second one that will enhance the skills of having conversations about voting that are in the context of the current issues that are happening. And there are a lot of issues happening right now. understand the history and how to engage with others, right? Because it's hard sometimes having conversations about voting, especially when we have so many different perspectives about it. But we're going to come together and learn how to utilize tools to make this November a historic event for people power and course correction that we desperately need in this country. This training tonight is the second of three in our People Power training series. This is training 2, engaging our people, equitable conversations, and understanding voter disenfranchisement. This is going to be such a dope training. I hope you got your pen and your paper. I'm going to keep saying it till you get it, okay? Get your pen and paper. By the time I get done talking, we'll be ready to move, okay? Next slide. Let's talk about the goals for today. So here are some of the skills that we really want you to walk away from this training with, right? How to apply the history of voter disenfranchisement in a more empathetic, to have more empathetic conversations, right? To understand those through lines, like when you talk to some folks who are like, I don't want to vote because X, Y, Z, like understand that some of the pushback that you're getting is part of a system that has been oppressing people and trying to disenfranchise folks. To identify disinformation and how it feeds to voter suppression, right? Next slide. To create your story of self to engage in relationship building, right? The work that we do as organizers is all about relationship building. Everything that we do is grounded in relationship. That's where you build trust, and that's where you can build camaraderie to really dig in through the hard work of changing the nation. And then to adopt and apply re-railing tactics to have more effective conversations. So I know I ran through that quickly, and I'm probably talking a little fast because I really want us to get into the meat of tonight. And I'm really excited about this, and I'm excited about the work that we've put into this. And I say this often, I want to definitely tip my hat to Kenia and Sonia for all the hard, diligent work that they have put into this. And with that, I am excited to dig in with you tonight. I hope you got that pen and paper I told you about. Tell the kids to chill out. Tell the dog to go in the corner and sit down and get in his bed. Let's get started. I am so excited to turn it over to my wonderful colleague, Sonia. Take it away.
Awesome. Thank you, Chris. That was a fantastic introduction. I'm very excited as well. So hey y'all, thank you so much for joining us. As Chris said, the first skill that we will be developing together today will be to put a new understanding of history to practice so that we can better support our communities, both through November for voting and also beyond. So first, I want to acknowledge how emotionally challenging this week has been. The racist police attack of Jacob Blake, the gratuitous white supremacist militant violence that spiked this week in Kenosha and Portland, a catastrophic hurricane in Louisiana, fires in California, widespread evictions in major cities like Houston, and the ongoing pandemic. It's a lot. On a regular basis, I acknowledge this violence with dispassion. I just kind of like, yep, that's really upsetting, but not that surprising. The anger doesn't really fade either, so it's kind of constantly a thing in the back of my mind. And what really broke me this week was the too early death of Chadwick Boseman. A man with so much light, brilliance, talent, vision, killed by cancer and a disease that disproportionately kills Black men. A man who had to struggle and be in pain in private, likely because of how inhospitable our world is to Black and disabled people. I want to ask for your patience and your grace today as we walk through this training, especially in the chat. Please be kind and open-minded to the people around you, especially in spaces like this where we've all come to learn together. And as I saw someone in the chat say, be lifelong learners. I love that phrase. Something I wanted to share with you is that when the world gets to me like this, it can be hard to find inspiration or motivation to stay in the fight for our people and communities. And that's what today's about. So in those times, I look to history. I look to the people who have taught me to bear and overcome before me. So we start again with a quote from the brilliant John Lewis, who this training series is dedicated to. You must also study and learn the lessons of history, because humanity has been involved in this soul-wrenching existential struggle for a very long time. People on every continent have stood in your shoes through decades and centuries before you. The truth does not change, and that is why the answers worked out long ago can help you find solutions to the challenges of our time. Brilliant. Our history and our ancestors lift me up when I'm staying down, and I want y'all to have access to these moments of inspiration too. So let's take a look at the history of voting rights in this country, both as a source of knowledge, empathy building, and inspiration. Next slide. So from the inception in the United States, voting laws and suppression have maintained white supremacist systems of power, privilege, and discrimination. Wealth, gender, race, restricted access to citizenship, and disability have been used to deny access to the 1776 promise that all people are created equal, that they're all endowed with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Understanding our collective history is so important before we can go out and talk to people about voting and understand their feelings about voting. So here on this slide is my timeline of caveats, as I like to call them, which highlights some of the victories our marginalized communities have made despite the systemic racism and centuries of voter suppression that they've experienced. So first, I want to start with the 15th Amendment in 1870. Following the Civil War, this amendment stated that the right to vote could not be denied by race. Notably, this only benefited Black men, since Indigenous people, women, and many Latinx and Asian immigrants were not defined as citizens yet. Also, due to many restrictions to the ballot, such as literacy tests, poll taxes, and general lack of enforcement in the South, even many Black men did not benefit from this. And sometimes those who had weren't able to later because of Jim Crow South. So pictured here is Thomas Mundy Peterson, the first Black voter in the United States. I didn't know who this person was before I started this training, and I was super excited to get to virtually meet him. As a quick plug for the power of mobilizing your network, in an 1870 interview, Peterson said that he was working on the morning of the election and did not think of voting until his boss came out to the stable where he was attending to the horses and advised him to go to the polls and exercise a citizen's privilege. And that's what this program's about. So it worked for the first voter who was a Black man in the US, and this is what we want to kind of keep encouraging our networks to do. So jump 50 years later, we have to wait 50 years to get a new kind of development in voting rights, but we finally get it in 1920. So the 19th Amendment stated that the right to vote could not be denied on the basis of sex. Yay, suffragettes, you did it. Still, this is not applied to many Black women because of the literacy test, poll taxes, etc. mentioned above. Indigenous people, again, many Latinx and Asian immigrants, or Puerto Ricans, who still don't have full access to voting. Equal parts racism and sexism almost resulted in this amendment not being passed, and the 15th Amendment being repealed 50 years after being signed because Southern senators were still salty about Black people voting. In their organizing also, white women left Black women out strategically. The National American Women's Suffrage Association's president, Carrie Chapman Catt, openly acknowledged that Black women in the South would likely be disenfranchised anyway, in precisely the same way that Black men had been, and thus should not be given a priority in their organizing. So we have a lot to learn from that time, and we hope that our organizing has evolved much more than for where it was then. So next, 1924, the Indian Citizenship Act. This law granted citizenship to all Native Americans born in the US. The right to vote, however, was governed by state law. So until 1957, actually, some states like Arizona and New Mexico barred Native Americans from voting. It's also important to remember that directly prior to this benevolent action, the US had sold unclaimed land and allocated acreage from the Dawes Act of 1887, resulting in the loss of 2/3 of the 138 million acres that Native Americans had held prior. And of course, the US had conducted relentless genocide and re-education of more than 100,000 Indigenous children, and the genocide is obviously much larger. Also, the Indian Citizenship Act was seen as a bit of a loss by advocacy groups at the time, and kind of a placating measure, because they've been advocating for treaty rights as well. So while it was a win, it was kind of something that was part of a longer trajectory for more comprehensive Indigenous rights. So then we jump to the Chinese Exclusion Act, which was repealed by the Magnuson Act in 1943. So the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 declared that all Chinese immigrants were ineligible for naturalization, including those who were already in the country. Basically, this prevented all Chinese immigrants from voting. Among other things, of course. When the Magnuson Act repealed the Chinese Exclusion Act, Chinese immigrants already residing in the country got the chance to become naturalized citizens again. And then we jump to the Voting Rights Act of 1965. On March 7th, 1965, on Bloody Sunday, state troopers descended on a peaceful protest in an unprovoked attack on the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama, which you will know if you research a little bit more about John Lewis, where protesters were en route to the state capitol in Montgomery. In response to this event and other acts of violence, President Johnson called for effective voting rights legislation, and Congress passed the Voting Rights Act of 1965. This legislation lifted up 1.5 million Black voters by getting rid of literacy tests, special provisions targeting at those areas of the country with histories of racial discrimination, and more. The VRA followed the 24th Amendment, which in 1964, prevented poll tax payments. One second. Sorry, my computer froze, everyone. 24th Amendment in 1964 and prevented poll tax payments from being used as a condition in federal elections. Importantly, these concessions came after decades of advocacy, mobilization, and protest. So the Voting Rights Act was part and parcel with the movement of Black organizers to get these rights for decades. And then we have the Voting Rights Act amendment in 1975. This was part of 5 amendments that came in. And I want to focus on the 1975 amendment because it benefited non-English speaking minorities. So Modesto Rodriguez, a 33-year-old farmer from Texas, defended America's forgotten minority, English as a second language immigrants, in front of Congress. Among many other incisive critiques of voting rights, access for Chicanos in the county, Rodriguez showed that Texas printed its election materials only in English, which served as a de facto literacy test for Chicanos. He said, "There has been a great failure on the part of the state of Texas to protect the voting rights of the Chicano electorate, and the 9 million Spanish-speaking citizens of this country depended on Congress to extend them their deserved right to vote. I want also to encourage everyone to read about the 50th anniversary of the Chicano Moratorium, which happened yesterday, which, amongst many things, was a peaceful protest against police brutality, racism, and the end of the Vietnam War, which ended abruptly because of police violence, where they also were asking to extend the use of non-English languages in counties, in the schools, in the system, and this affected voting as well. So this has been an ongoing battle that we're still fighting today. And lastly, the Americans with Disabilities Act in 1970. Title II requires state and local governments to ensure that people with disabilities have a full and equal opportunity to vote. Further laws have had to be passed, obviously, to make this a reality by making polling places more accessible. And pictured here is Ed Roberts, often called the father of independent living, for his extensive activism for disabled folks. And in the next training, we'll talk more about more inspiration that we can draw from activists and organizers throughout our history. But hopefully this timeline of caveats shows you that we have overcome so much, we have achieved so much, and all of these struggles have been kind of partial, right? There's so much for us to kind of keep pushing forward so that the next generation has better access to the voting block. Next slide, please. So now I want to share with you a vision for the future, if you will. I believe that if we imagine a better world, we can actualize it. And so we're excited by the idea of making our world better and more just. So here I want to provide you with kind of a brainstorm. It's our brainstorm, so there might be other things that you think should be up here. And I welcome you to put those in the chat. But basically, here's kind of a timeline for the future where we envision our generation can have an impact for pushing forward voting rights and access during our lifetime. So the first suggestion that we have is ending class discrimination by making Election Day a holiday. people shouldn't have to choose between voting and their jobs. And often they have to do that because they're working full-time jobs and they don't make it to the ballot box before they're able to. Restored Voting Rights Act, reversing the 2013 SCOTUS Shelby County versus Holder decision. Basically, for those of you who aren't familiar with this decision, previously states and localities with a history of racial discrimination needed to get permission from the federal government to enact any changes to their voting laws in a process called pre-clearance. Since that stopped in 2013, because this pre-clearance was found to be unconstitutional in 2013, states like North Carolina, Texas, and Florida took the opportunity to implement new restrictions around voter ID, early voting, same-day registration. And we believe that in a world where discrimination is researched and challenged and valued and acknowledged, so there's currently legislation on restoring the Voting Rights Act, and this is a potential vision for the future. 2020 question mark? I don't know. Maybe we'll get it soon, but we can if we kind of come together. Another idea is reenfranchising ex-felons. So the United States remains one of the world's strictest nations when it comes to denying the right to vote to citizens convicted of crimes. An estimated 6.1 million Americans are forbidden to vote because of felony disenfranchisement or laws restricting voting rights for those convicted of felony-level crimes. This number shot up from an estimated 1 million in 1976 to up to 6 million, like I mentioned, and tracks with the extremely disproportionate impact of incarceration on Black people in this country. Another idea is no suppressive purging. So according to a study by the Brennan Center for Justice, at least 17 million voters have been purged nationwide between 2016 and 2018. And the majority of those purges have been in counties and states with histories of racial discrimination, kind of affected by the 2013 SCOTUS decision that I mentioned. So we want to get rid of that. And lastly, DC statehood. People in DC do not have representation in the Senate or the House, except a non-voting delegate in the House. And historically, opposition to this has been based on attempts by senators to not expand the voting power of the predominantly Black electorate in downtown DC. So part of making this joint vision and many more ideas that I'll read through the chat later, a reality, we need to mobilize this election. So this week we discussed the past and future of voting, and next week we'll be discussing our present. So how will we be voting in the time of COVID? So I encourage you to join us then. But for now, I want to bring up Chris and Kenia to talk about our past and our joint vision for the future and how we hope that this can inspire us for the next election. So Chris and Kenia, welcome back. I want to hear from y'all where you would put your family and yourself on this timeline and these timelines, and just overall what you thought of this part of the presentation.
You know, first of all, as somebody who thinks of themselves as a history buff, I just want to say that I didn't know some of these things.
I didn't either.
And, and it's like, wait a minute, like what? But it's so crazy because it's like when I have conversations with people, whether they be folks in my family, whether it be people who are part of my community, there is so much in what you spoke about in terms of the history that sort of influences the future. And some of it is not up to date, right? Like there are still remnants of old suppressions, even though they are still suppressions, that still plague the ideology of how people view voting. And like that's the power of voter suppression, right? Like if you start to suppress people, and especially people who have been oppressed, not to rhyme, but like you create sort of this thinking pattern where it's like even when you get freedom, it's like, or a little piece of more freedom, you have to do the work to continue to get your mind to wrap around the newness of the experience, right? So that was super clear, but like as I listened to you talk about the different historical aspects, what came to me is like, okay, not only the work to make this law, but the work to work on the perception of voting because of the suppression of voting. You know, yeah, that's what came to my mind in that moment.
What about
Yeah.
you, Kenia?
Same. I was like, oh, I need to write down these names because we know that our curriculum is a little whitewash, shall we say. So thank you so much for uplifting those voices. And one of the things that hit me the most is, there was huge celebrations and kind of actions in the street for the 100 years of the women's right to vote. And just kind of sitting back and thinking, well, it hasn't been 100 years for me or my family as, a Cuban American female. So really putting that in perspective and how sometimes we just look through a lens of, oh, this is such a great win, but really seeing that folks did get left behind. So their enthusiasm may not be the same, but acknowledging that piece is really welcoming them into the conversation. So that was huge to really see that play out.
Absolutely. Yeah. And for myself, half of my family currently lives in Puerto Rico, so they do not get to participate in federal elections, and they do not have representation in the Senate and in the House. So when I put myself on this timeline, we have a 0-year anniversary, people. So anyway, that's kind of interesting.
It's a little jarring when you say it. It's like, wait, like where? Wow. Okay.
And the history of Puerto Rico is a little different, so we would have to have a different conversation there. But anyway, it is interesting at least to see in the 40s there were, I didn't know about this, but the conception of who is a citizen affected who gets to vote. So the way that this vote was disenfranchised fundamentally was who gets perceived as a citizen. So even when we acquired states like Alaska and Hawaii, we didn't perceive them as citizens because they were predominantly indigenous in both of those cases. So that has been what was really inspiring for me, is this fundamental idea that I do believe that we're all citizens. I do believe that even if we aren't, we deserve to be treated with humanity and respect. And when it comes to voting, we definitely deserve to have a role and a voice in how our history and our communities get shaped.
Definitely.
So, oof. See, I love.
It's like it's so much history and it's so much work at the same time. So I'm in that in between space of like, oh yes, and so much work. Oh, we have come so far, and we have so much more to do. And making sure that this is extended to everybody who has the right to vote.
Exactly. Awesome. Okay, Kenia, walk us through how we can kind of, in our own lives, fight against these voter disenfranchisement forces.
Absolutely. So on the next slide, we're going to see some voter disenfranchisement tactics. So some that were already mentioned, but just because they're in our past doesn't mean that we've overcome them completely. So a lot of these tactics are still alive and well and, shall we say, flourishing in this current administration. So to Sonia's point, the right to vote is the most fundamental constitutional right for a good reason. In a democracy, we cannot exist without electoral participation of the people, because we vote because we, the people, are supposed to shape our government, not the other way around. So a lot of time and energy gets invested to kind of make sure that goes away. So here are some of the tactics that we see. Intimidation. That could be anything from threatening people, saying that law enforcement is going to be at the polls, or just threatening folks for exercising their rights in general. And this could be online, this could be in person. So acknowledging that everything here is intersectional. Voter ID laws that are put in place specifically to disenfranchise folks, whether you need to go get a new ID or whether your out-of-state ID is different. reentrants that are back in society not having their IDs from institutions being validated, even though they're state issued IDs. So again, things to think about. Restrictions on how we could register to vote and when, changing deadlines. Voter purges, also like Sonia mentioned, this is something that is being done with more veracity than in the past. So paying attention to, even if we are registered, have we been purged? Felony disenfranchisement, this is huge. Florida right now is still up in the air in terms of whether reinsurance can vote. Excuse only absentee ballots. This is something we're seeing play out right now with COVID-19. Some states are saying you need to have a reason to request a ballot. Some states are not, and it's ever changing. Polling locations being an issue. This could be from having only one polling place in a huge metropolitan area, or have inadequate machines or personnel at polling places. So again, another thing to think about when we think of access, and what does that really mean? Gerrymandering. This is when specific districts are developed or cut out to favor a majority or a privilege. So we hear about this a lot, and this is why the census is super important for us. If we fill out the census, we can draw those lines a little bit better and hopefully fight that piece of disenfranchisement. And finally, disinformation. We're going to have a whole section about this. And so I just want to point out here that this is also used as a way to disenfranchise folks. So how do we fight this? Next slide, please. So at an individual level, the best way to fight voter suppression is to vote. I know it sounds simple, but we have to vote like we never voted before, with numbers in such excess that they can't be challenged. So voting is how we fight this. The ability to participate in our political system and in the power of our ability to cast a vote is the cornerstone of our nation, and it's what unites us in a democracy. So when that power is lost, we lose the ability to shape our policies and political agendas. So we have to make sure we vote. So we need to register to vote. As a mobilizer, also making sure that your vote team is registered at the current address is super important. Understanding how to have this conversation and being mindful of folks who may not be able to register is also a way to have that empathetic, engaging conversation. Check your registration. So like we mentioned, the voter purges happen a lot. So check your registration early and often. This is something we can do right now with your voting team. Vote and help others to vote. So being a vote mobilizer, you can engage and support others through this process. Help people choose a voting option. And if you join us next training, we're going to talk all about that so we can make sure everyone is prepared. Holding your officials accountable. Now, y'all, you've been doing this for the last almost 4 years, making those phone calls, showing out in the street, sending those letters, those petitions, those postcards. We have to continue to do this. We have to remind our electeds that they work for us. And we have to continue to make those phone calls and make sure that we're following up on the promises that they made. Also, advocating for voting rights. Activism and engaging in voting efforts locally, having vote plans, understanding the deadlines, and also supporting the new Voting Rights Act that was just renamed for John Lewis. And completing the census. Decision-making at all levels of government is impacted by the census. Reappointment of seats to the House of Representatives, drawing federal, state, and local legislative districts, how much money goes into an education budget, all of that is impacted by the census. So a special shout out before the deadline to complete the census, y'all. So as the late great Congressman John Lewis said in his final op-ed which was published the day of his funeral. Voting and participating in the democratic process are key. The vote is the most powerful nonviolent change agent you have in a democratic society. You must use it because it is not guaranteed. You can lose it. So with that in mind, let's go to the next slide. And this is how we own our power. We own our power by owning our vote. So as you see on the screen, there's a Stacey Abrams GIF that says, if they didn't want us to be quiet, they wouldn't be working this hard to shut us up. So we've heard some statistics already today about how much work is being done to disenfranchise folks. They're spending millions and millions of dollars to attack us in courts and with propaganda and general just fear and intimidation. So it's important to understand that there are 3 fundamental stages of voting. There's registration, access, and counting. We have to own our power in each one of these stages to make sure our voice is heard. Engaging and supporting people in our vote team through each step of this process and following up with them can help the likelihood of having a successful counted vote for each person on our vote team. In the next training, we'll be educating you on different voting options and how to help your vote team be successful. You can start now by making sure that members of your vote team are registered to vote by checking with your local election office. I'd like to bring all my colleagues up on video now just to talk a little bit more about voter suppression and different experiences that we have. Great. Hey, everybody.
Yeah.
So in thinking about the moment that we're in conversations someone might have with their vote team, what type of voter suppression can you expect, either for yourself or for your vote team, to encounter in this election? And for folks on chat, feel free to share that.
Well, I've already seen some great ones in the chat. Defunding of USPS, lack of childcare, misinformation has come up. I think all of those COVID-19 related things are definitely something we can expect.
Absolutely.
Yeah, you know, like it's some of the typical stuff. Like I live in Chicago, but I went to school down in Georgia, and I've had folks that I know purge from voting rolls. So like making sure that you keep abreast on a regular basis that your name is on the voting roll, right? Because they will drop you in certain places. And I, you know, also in some places where they start like closing down polling places, and you know, folks, especially if you have a job, if you are somebody who votes in person, you need to like, you know, take time to go, you know, go vote. Like if the less polling places, the harder it is for you to do that, which talks sort of is a reference to the wanting voting day to be national holiday, because it's like we need folks to be able to have the time to go and actually vote. But like a lot of times it's the small things. Like we look for the really big things. It's the small things that hurt folks, you know. And so one of the things that I know is like having the tenacity to be like, I'm gonna cast this doggone ballot. like you know, like you are not going to stand in my way from me casting my ballot, and I'm going to do my due diligence to do so. Yeah, so that's what I can anticipate.
And to lift up a question in the chat regarding the purging from Lynn WP, how do people check that they're still registered? And that's super important in places where people are getting purged from the rolls. So what you can do is check your registration status with your local election clerk. What does that look like? Sometimes they have a website. So you as the vote mobilizer will help your vote team decide if this is something that they can check on the website. You can also call your local election clerk and they can verify your information by address and name. We also have a link that was put in the chat from MoveOn where you can also check your registration status. But the official source is, of course, like your local election office. So this tool in the chat can help you do so easily. And we encourage you to use that. And if you feel extra unsure or uncertain, definitely check with your local election clerk, either by email, calling, or just on the website if they have that available.
Thank you for lifting that up, Sonia. That's super important. We realize that access means so much more when really breaking down these different ways of voter suppression or like fighting the pandemic. So great things to talk about, but definitely checking with your local election, your local county, to make sure that you're registered. And if you're supposed to receive a ballot and that doesn't happen, that's that follow-up piece that we talk about, right? So helping folks make sure they have what they need to vote. And I just love seeing everything that's happening in the chat box. Thank you so much for your comments.
Can I say something right before?
Sure.
I just feel this in my heart. Don't be afraid to ask questions, right?
Yes.
Like, don't be afraid to be that person that when the Board of Elections see your phone number, they're like, oh, right? Right.
Keep calling.
Like another way that suppression happens, and we see it in many other forms in these last 4 years, especially, is through exhaustion, right? And just being like sometimes, especially when somebody's trying to keep you from something, they hope that you just give up in the middle of the process, right? They hope that somehow you get tired of engaging, tired of asking questions, tired of doing that. Do not get weary in well-doing. That's sort of a reference. I'm a church boy. But like, don't give up. Be tenacious in asking your questions and understanding your local laws around voting and the access to it. It is okay to do that. You pay your taxes. You live in this country. You have the right to ask any doggone question you want to ask. And you have the right to ask it of any person who collects a check from the government, okay? But you can talk to me about that later because I felt myself going there in a minute. But
y'all, we're tired. We're tired.
Right.
Don't let us get tenacious because we tired. So they better answer us. That's for sure. Thank you, Chris. I felt that in my heart. So with that, not only do we need to ask questions, but we also need to be ready to have conversations and communicate with folks about how that does hit your soul. So I'm going to turn it over to Sonia to talk about how we do our personal story and communicate those things.
Hey, welcome back. All right, next section is about story of me, you, us, and now. So I want to take a quick second. If you're just joining us, welcome. This is a Mobilize to Win People Power training series. We've been talking about how to get 10 people in our network to come out to vote. So far, we've talked about our history, how it influenced voting rights in this country, and how it creates kind of tactics that we have to develop to respond to voter suppression. And now we're talking about how to communicate that history in a way that's inspiring to people and that gets them kind of on our boat with us. And then later, of course, we'll be talking about disinformation and how to actually apply everything we're learning to have better, effective conversations. So let's get a bit positive and visionary. So an important piece of organizing this election is storytelling. You'll be sharing your story and asking others to share theirs in order to make deeper connections. And we've prepared kind of a worksheet for you to work through after this training, which will be posted on our website. And right now, we just want to introduce you to some of those main concepts here with you. So how do we talk about the story of you, me, you, us, and now? Next slide, please. Organizing is about building people power. So this is about having conversations with others to achieve a shared action. Your narrative should tell a story of the values shared by those whom you hope to move to collective action. And the test of a good story is whether or not listeners understand their connection with each other and the work being done. So if this is kind of scary, this is kind of new, we want you to help you through that process. So here's some questions that you can consider whenever you're thinking about your own story. What has shaped you? What experiences have affected how you perceive yourself? How have your life experiences affected your values, your motivations, priorities, and your goals? And then let's think about developing that story. So think of a time when you felt some sort of challenge. Think of a choice you made to try to overcome that challenge, and think of the outcome. And that's a very basic, broad overview. But when we panel again, all three of us up on screen will kind of share examples of that. And I have a really good treat for y'all in the form of a video of a really amazing example of story of self, us, and now with Kenia. So the second step of this is story of us, our narrative. So telling a story of us requires, after having kind of the story of self, putting the experience of us into a narrative and lifting up our common values and encouraging people to act through those. So the story of us must be rooted in our common experiences from the people that you've chosen in your vote team. It includes shared history, which is why we talked about history, shared struggle, which is why next training, we'll be talking about the history of organizing, shared values, which is why we've talked about the principles of voter engagement, and a shared vision, which is why we've shared this kind of vision for the future with you. Story of us do the hard work of inspiring people who may have difficulty feeling inspired due to external conditions, especially during this time. You can also develop the story using this kind of same broad framework of challenge, choice, and outcome, all included in the worksheet. And lastly, we bring it all together for the story of now and the urgency of the moment. So COVID-19 has revealed deep cracks in the foundations of our democracy. Decades of racist, neglectful policies have ensured that Black, Indigenous, and POC individuals, disabled individuals, LGBTQI individuals have been disproportionately affected by the pandemic. And it's important to note that this catastrophe, honestly, was largely preventable, which is why voting in this election is so important. It is our job to fight against and repair the harm that has been visited upon our communities. And that's why we're kind of calling us together to support each other through all of the challenges of 2020. That's an example of the story of now that you can kind of use, but of course mold to your own vote team. So you and your vote team will be the difference in this election. I truly believe that, we truly believe that, which is why we're having this training series. And the conversations you have and the actions you take in this moment will have an immediate and lasting effect in this country and all around the world. So next slide, please. The Story of Self resource, like I said, will be available on our website after this training. Here's kind of a screenshot of the first page so you know what it looks like. But for now, what I want to do is show you an example of how story of me, you, us, and now can effectively come together to create a really powerful narrative. So I'm so excited and inspired. And honestly, the first time I saw this video, I low-key cried. But I want to play for y'all a video from our very own Kenia about her story. So if we could play that video now, that would be great. And after that, we'll come back and kind of talk and reflect about it.
Our entire family got infected with the coronavirus. My mother, who was 75 years old, did test positive a couple of days after I did. She went to a routine doctor's appointment, and from there she was taken via ambulance into the hospital. And that was the last day we got to see her. I don't want any other family to have to go through that. I don't want any other family to have a virtual viewing. I don't want another family to not be able to say goodbye. It's scary to know that the United States is such a powerful force and we are literally last in handling human life.
I can only say that we're doing more than anybody in the world by far.
The reason we are how bad we are is because the person who's the occupant of the White House decided to play an ego trip on the US, and people are dying daily because of that.
Here's the bad part. When you do testing to that extent, you're gonna find more people, you're gonna find more cases. So I said to my people, slow the testing down, please.
What would you have done differently facing this crisis?
Well, nothing. I don't take responsibility at all.
The systemic disparities are very apparent in this pandemic. As we know, Black and Brown communities are usually at the front line of all of this. Then when we talk about the pandemic in a prison, well, we also know that the disproportionate amount of Black and Brown folks are incarcerated. My parents were Cuban refugees And I was always taught that your voice is super important, and that's why they made their journey to America. A big part of my upbringing and what was instilled in me was this is a place where you can use your voice. Like, you won't get hurt for using your voice. And that was just such a long-standing lesson. So my mom was very vocal. There was never anything that she couldn't get done. She was definitely a firecracker and willing to jump in, and she was a staple at all our rallies. One of my favorite pictures of her is kind of holding my bullhorn and she's just yelling at someone. So she was definitely engaged and always encouraged others to be engaged. And that was, I think, just a long-standing impact. I'm definitely carrying that on, and I think she inspired folks to do the same. We would always go vote together, and it was just like, this is what this is about. This is freedom, and you have to fight for it because it could easily be destroyed. And juxtaposition to what's happening now, I think that's one of the biggest motivators, is that we're literally seeing what hundreds of thousands of immigrants have fought and died for to be here, and what Americans died for to secure these rights are vanishing. And that's tragic and devastating. You can't just stand by and let that happen. I found MoveOn in the mid-90s with some petitions, and just kind of was attached ever since. It was always a way to be active, even if it wasn't locally. More recently, we had been focused on the elections, training folks on canvassing, getting information out about why it's important to vote, asking people their stories about why voting is important, helping folks just in every aspect of organizing, how to tell your story, how to just learn where to get information, and just getting people excited again, to kind of get rid of that hopelessness that could kind of sink in at times when you feel like you don't have any power. What makes me hopeful is that we have seen such a change in what a lot of us were used to, what democracy looks like, what it needs to look like. That light has been shined, really focusing on, we could really do this. Like, we could take this back. Our voice is so powerful that why would they work this hard to silence us? So we have power. And that's my message to everyone I talk to. No matter how you can participate, you doing one thing different to help us get a better tomorrow is going to be how we're going to win this.
Okay, so, woof. That video is just amazing. Kenia's amazing. I'm so overwhelmed to have her on my team and to get to work with her. And yeah, anyway, great. I think a perfect, actually, example of how to apply story of me, us, now. So we're all here. What did y'all think about that? And Kenia, you can get to say anything you want, obviously, because it's your video. So,
well, just thank you. It's an honor to be able to share that story. I can't believe how relevant it is, like everything that was happening, and how much it impacts everyone. So thank you for allowing me to share that with you all. And like I said in the beginning, my dad propelled me in this work, but also my mom. She was right there with me, yelling at people. And Latinas like to yell, so that's we definitely get our voice heard. So this is how powerful it is. This is the impact daily of mismanagement and what happens if they do try to silence us. So I just want everyone to think about that and how that could impact yourself, your family, someone you care about. There's something that, regardless of how centered we are or how left we are, that joins us united in this struggle, because this is literally life and death. And if that is what it takes to get us to vote, then we're here. We can't get tired. So really just having that be the conversation is super important. And I thank you all for allowing me to share that with you.
I want to make one quick note before we move. For those of you who are looking at this video, because I've seen it a couple of times, and it always pulls at that heartstring, right? And some of you might be thinking, well, okay, well, I don't have a video that's produced with my story, right? And so, touche, I hear you, right? I think the power of this video, right, even if this is just a conversation with, say, you and Kenia, is to highlight what is it that's at stake for you, right?
Mm-hmm.
How is this affecting you? Because that's what moves people, right?
Mm-hmm.
What moves people to actually listen to what you have to say is how this affects you. A lot of times when we talk about voting, we try to tell people how it's going to affect them. Sometimes you need to take a step back and say, well, this is how it's affected me, right? This is what I'm voting for. This is why this is important for me. And that is the thing that actually reaches down to the heart of people, not you trying to tell them what's important to them as if you know
Mm-hmm.
what's important to them, as if somehow you're in their brain, right? But like localizing it to yourself is what actually moves people. Like sharing that piece of yourself with people is what moves folks to do and to pay attention to what you're saying. So again, you may not have a produced video, but you do have a story
Mm-hmm.
that has been on the stage of your life. And there's a lot of characters in it. There's a plot. There's some antagonists and protagonists in that sucker. So please feel free to be like, oh, okay, I might have that, but I do have a story. And there is a reason why this is important to me. And this is why I talk about this to the folks that I talk about it to. This is why I'm encouraging people to vote, because this is how this has affected me. All right, that's all I had to say.
Yeah, I have nothing much to add other than it was so amazing to see all the love that Kenia deservedly is getting in the chat. One particularly powerful comment from Kristen. Thank you for the power of your story, Kenia. It is so powerful. Your mother was really amazing in using her new voice in this country and her life. And another comment from Indivisible Will. I don't know if I said that right. Probably not. The word that resonated in what Kenia said was power. Many people don't believe that Black and brown people have power, but we do. And couldn't have said it better. So with that, I want to pass it to Kenia to talk a little bit about disinformation.
Thank you all so much. I appreciate all your love and support. And she's definitely up there looking down on us and wanting to get our butts in motion. So thank you all so much. This next part I want to talk to you about is disinformation. We mentioned it a little bit earlier in the training about how it's a tactic for voter disenfranchisement. We're going to talk a little bit more about what is this disinformation. So we are here to empower our friends and family and community, and we want to make sure that they know about all their voting rights and how important it is to vote, and be aware that there's information out there that kind of tingles our psychological spidey senses and might make us think about different things to either be a distraction. So we are literally fighting weapons of mass distraction with this information. And it's not new, but it's definitely been ramped up and amplified in these last few election cycles. So on the next slide, I want to talk to you about what is disinformation. So what you see on the screen is kind of like a Venn diagram. When we talk about information, it might be helpful to talk about it as an ecosystem, kind of existing in different ways. So let's break it down into three elements. One is the different types of content that's being created and how it's shared. Two, the motivation of those who created the content. And three, ways that the content is being disseminated. So with that kind of in mind, let's talk about what is misinformation. So information that is false, but is not created with the intention of causing harm. Whereas disinformation the other hand, is widely defined as the purposeful dissemination of false information with an intended action to mislead or harm. So although it's a straightforward definition, it can be difficult to kind of pinpoint like criteria for that. So for example, disinformation is always composed of fabrications. Is not always composed of fabrication. It can consist of some true facts, maybe pieced together in a different way to make it contextually different. And just a note on malinformation, this is information that is generally true, but it can be used to cause damage to a person. So this could be like leaked emails of personal information or private photos. Basically, its main purpose is to destroy the reputation of folks. So if we also think of this as like a scale of like intent to harm, it might also be easier. So forms of this could be like satire or parody. SNL is looking more and more like real life every day, but we do have to acknowledge that is satire. So no intention to cause harm, but has potential to fool people. A false connection. This is when a headline or visuals don't support the content. So it could kind of have a misleading headline, but it really has nothing to do with what's being talked about in the article, for example. Misleading information could be like an article saying that this is the cause of COVID-19, as an example. And then it starts boiling off into other things. So again, just a way to mislead or frame an issue. False context is when genuine content is shared, but with the false contextual information. So this could be where a real photo from like 5 years ago is used to show something about now. Imposter content. This is when you have content from a source that is being copied. So instead of like abcnews.com, it's abcnews.com.co. So we'll talk a little bit of ways to be able to identify that. Or just straight up fake news, right? 100% false and designed to deceive, cause harm, or to have other malintent. So on the next slide, let's talk a little bit about how it's used for voter suppression and how some of the tactics that we talked about earlier are also tied to disinformation. So we have a history in the last election, the last few election cycles, of Black and POC voters being targeted with the wrong election date. There was a campaign of postcards, texts, and phone calls that was specifically targeted to folks, to Black and Brown voters, that was saying, hey, you know what? It's not November 6th, it's actually this day. Propaganda about voter fraud. So voter fraud was often invoked in the segregationist era as an excuse to crack down on the rights of Blacks and poor whites. But we've seen this amplified in the recent election cycles. So the more they throw out that word propaganda, it's also a tactic to kind of trigger us to think psychologically, to not trust the system. So understand that that's being a tactic used against us. False information used to depress turnout, whether that is, there's not machines, or they start talking about a specific candidate, and it might turn you off completely to the voting process. And then intimidation, online to offline. So we know that in 2016, the GOP was hiring watchdogs to be poll watchers, and they would verbally or even at times threaten to physically intimidate folks. And also, this could be a threat of saying ICE, for example, being present at polling places. So what do we do? On the next slide, we're going to talk about how we recognize disinformation and what we can do to stop it. So we have this GIF here that says pause, verify, and share. I feel like that's like the 80s stop, look, and listen. Did I just date myself? Okay, no. So it's important for us as consumers of information to be able to recognize disinformation and do what we can from spreading it. So basic things we could do is just check the date. Are you sharing something from last month or is it last year? You want to check the date, the author, and the source. Are you retweeting? Can you find the original tweet? That's super important. Also, read the actual story. Like we talked about, there's titles that have nothing to do with the content of the actual article. So reading the story and getting the information is super helpful. Supporting sources. Can you find a story elsewhere? Is it a lone wolf in the information out there on the internet? You can use fact-checking sites that are, if you just Google them, there are several. But if you really want to be that investigator, you can do that. Make sure you're sharing from the original source, like we mentioned earlier. And if someone shares something with you, you want to engage them in a conversation and discuss why this could be harmful if they're sharing disinformation. So I know we kind of just threw a lot at you. I want to bring back my colleagues and just have a little conversation about disinformation. And if any of you all type in the chat if you've ever been impacted by disinformation, either with relationships, if you experience that in a voting cycle. So let's chat about that. What do y'all think?
You know, I was working back in 2012. I worked on the Obama campaign, and I had a coworker. I was here in Chicago and as a field organizer, and I had a coworker who worked on another part of town, who was also a field organizer doing some great work. Fast forward 4 years later, there was a tweet with her picture on it that was pushing out the wrong day to vote. And she had no clue. Somebody had taken her picture. I think she was at a Hillary office, and was literally using it to target Black folks to go and vote on the wrong day. That's how I knew it was for real, for real. I mean, I knew it was real, but like that's how I knew it was real, because literally I had a coworker who was used to spread disinformation. It was crazy. It was really scary. So that was one of my experiences with disinformation.
That's just crazy. I mean, our pictures are out there, y'all. At least trying to not make this, something that we're passing misinformation about. Just to highlight something from the chat about where does Fox News lie on the spectrum? Well, we could go there a lot. So understanding the source, knowing, taking things with a grain of salt. Can we verify? Is it just from, some dude that showed up on Fox News who's never ever been a journalist before? Or can we track this in some other way? So we just want to make sure that we're being diligent when we're looking at information. So considering the source, first of all, is super important. But also finding other sources to verify it. How does this land with us? And are we just dismissing it because it might not be something we agree with? Or is there actual evidence that we can support to kind of help decipher some of this stuff?
Yeah, the main thing that I'm thinking about right now is just that how I would encounter or counter misinformation and disinformation that happens in my life. And I think that personally, I feel much more comfortable doing it on a one-on-one basis. And that's maybe not the reality for everyone, but I want to encourage everyone that's listening to us to think about this information in the context of your vote team. So disinformation and misinformation is around all of us. How do you think it will affect your conversations? Because I personally don't have the energy to sit on Facebook responding to every piece of disinformation and misinformation that I see on my timeline. It's just the reality. So I want to encourage everyone to acknowledge it, acknowledge the impact that it has on their lives. If you're close to someone and you know that it's probably not intentionally bad, just kind of DM them and be like, yo, this is false or misinformation or disinformation. And yeah, don't spend all your day on Facebook and give those people your energy. You know, it's kind of not worth it sometimes.
You're absolutely right. And there's so much of it. We would literally not be able to do anything else if we were just tracking everybody down. But thank you all so much for all the comments in the chat. This is a super important topic, so we just need to be mindful. But understanding that information is just one piece of the message, I do want to pass it over to Sonia, where she's going to dig deep into effective conversations and how you can have that one-on-one discussion with folks. So over to Sonia.
Perfect, everyone. I'm so excited. Thank you so much for sticking around with us. I wanted to acknowledge that we're taking a little bit of time today, but that's because all of these topics are super important. So the last thing on our schedule today is effective conversations. So far, we've talked about our voting rights history, how it impacts voter suppression today, how to use our overcoming and our collective history to find inspiration, how to create a story of us, me, you, us and now, disinformation and misinformation, and now effective conversations. So next slide. First, I want to review last week, or I keep saying that, last training, where we talked about the tenets of inclusive voter engagement. As I mentioned last time, these principles were inspired by the Black Lives Matter movement, the movement for Black Lives, Kenneth Jones and Tema Oku's characteristics of white supremacy, culture, and Black feminist, queer, and anti-colonial scholarship from authors such as Bell Hooks and Audre Lorde. So in this slide, you can see our 5 tenets, which are shed ego, center the margin. Tenet 2, shed shame and adopt empathy. Tenet 3, shed prejudice and adopt an open mind. Tenet 4, shed cynicism and adopt rebellious joy. And tenet 5, shed perfectionism and adopt resilience. So you've been hearing all of these themes today, and I want to remind you that our working assumption is that if the person who has experienced the most voter suppression in their lifetime at the current moment is supported to vote this election, all of us will have the capacity to go out and vote this election. So, next slide. Our hope and what we wanted to talk to you about today is that when these tenets, like we talked last training, are applied, we can have more effective conversations. So what does it look like to have a more effective conversation? After we utilize these inclusive voter engagement tenets that we presented to you, our hope is that we can create a fertile soil where we can kind of have the sprouting of these conversations. What does it look like for these sprouts to happen? Well, first, this effective conversation will be continuous. So it actually won't just be, it's kind of a misleading idea to just think of it as like one effective conversation. It's many. It's going to be a continuous, both texting, phone calls, in person if you live with this person or if you just happen upon them in these COVID times. But it takes work. It takes not necessarily work. I don't think of it as work. I think more of it as like just continuous engagement with that person. These conversations will be reciprocal. So it'll be kind of a two-way street. And I want to remind y'all that last training, we talked about the different types of voters. We talked about new voters, new citizens, and how they need education and an emphasis on how they now have the right to vote, how re-entrants are also considered new voters and they also need education and kind of a conversation about rights and issue advocacy. And the excited and informed voter. So a person who just needs to be reminded that it's their duty to vote, that they should make a vote plan, what type of vote plan they have, and to encourage them to volunteer. Now, there's another set of voters who maybe are diehard Trump supporters or are people who you're not going to be able to persuade by November. And I want to encourage you to go through the friend mapping guide and think, who are the 10 people who I can support the most in this election to overcome their voter depression, as Stacey Abrams says, who are maybe a little bit disillusioned right now and who really need you to be kind of their friend and ally in this moment and help them overcome that. So those are the people we want you to think about. Again, for those of you wondering in the chat, the friend mapping guide is on our website where you can find also recording of all these trainings. So if you can't catch us or you had to leave, you can watch the rest of the recording at Mobilize to Win. Great. So now I want everyone to kind of take a second, breathe. We've been here for a while, and thank you so much for being here. And I want you to close your eyes really quickly. Empty your thoughts, in and out. And now I'm going to say some words out loud, and I want you to imagine the first person that comes to mind when I say these words. Hardworking Americans, suburban voters, patriots. Now think of gangs, criminals, illegal, single mother, welfare recipient. What images came up for you? Were you surprised by the power of these images? I know I was. These words that I just kind of threw out at you are racial dog whistles. And the idea of it is that they're kind of implicit calls to biases that are entrenched in people's mind, usually racist, internalized biases. They often bring up really strong emotions, and they're used to motivate and ask people to kind of do an action, such as like vote for a certain candidate. So this exercise aims at showing you the strength of psychology and the meta-narratives pushed by money and politics and racism. So, for instance, I think my mom and dad are the hardest working people on earth. And the first time I did this exercise, a random farmer popped up in my head. And that's not to say that that person doesn't work really hard, but they're not the only person. So this is kind of an exercise in showing us the power of language and words and the impact that they will have on the conversations that you are having with your vote team. These forces are always at work when we're having conversations with anyone. So I want to bring up Kenia to talk about how they show up in our convos, and specifically how they show up as derailing tactics and how you can derail a conversation again.
Thank you, Sonia. I love the power of that exercise. I think it really sets us up to talk about these conversations. So on this next slide, we have some derailing tactics that we've commonly seen. So have you ever spoken about, maybe you're having a conversation with someone, you're talking about some injustice that you saw, only to find yourself having a completely different conversation about an unrelated topic. So if you've ever been derailed, you probably were having conversations in a political realm. And I just also want to say that my dog feels very strongly about derailing, and I apologize that he's in the back. So what is derailing? Derailing is a process by which a discussion or a debate or an exchange of ideas can be subverted into a completely different issue. It's literally a form of silencing. So derailing is a loss of initial context and purpose of a discussion, and it's usually at the detriment of some oppressed group. So on the slide, you see these 8 common derailing tactics. So when people say, just cheer up, when you're talking about maybe a shooting that happened or the latest police brutality issue, people will say the good person debate, that there might be, that there's good people, but it really just kind of takes away from the actual issue that you're talking about. It could be worse, trying to get into oppression Olympics, as they say. Things could always be worse, right? Or when people just want to have a conversation, they have good intentions, but it lands wrong. It ends up causing harm. Tone policing, calling someone, a nasty woman or aggressive when you're passionate about what you're sharing. So abstract hypotheticals. If you've ever had a conversation where someone's like, well, hypothetically, this can happen, you're totally off base. And finally, talking about problems that privileged people have. This is when someone wants to take on an issue that says, say you're talking about a specific form of discrimination, and someone from a majority group is like, oh, well, that's happened to me too. A good example of this is the All Lives Matter slogan. We are not talking about that. This is not a debate. We're talking about, for instance, the Black Lives Matter movement and how it's been systemically oppressed and why it specifically has to be said as an example. So what do we do with this? What do we do with these conversations? On the next slide, we have ways you could re-rail a conversation. We're using this term to say that re-railing is the ability to recover the original trajectory of a difficult conversation and impart the actual ideas and feelings and content that you were trying to say. So this usually happens by acknowledging that the other person is derailing. So saying, hey, you know what? That's not what the conversation we were having. Can we please finish the conversation? So if we do this effectively, hopefully this reopens up the original conversation, alleviates the anger and defensiveness. It can affirm the relationship between you and the person that you're having a conversation with, and it keeps focus on the issue. So back to those tenets about what makes it effective, this will have a reciprocal outcome. So goal setting is basically just having a goal for your conversation. What are you trying to say? Sometimes we just have to call a spade a spade. We just need to name that maybe what the person is saying distracted from the original point, or that they're derailing. Putting it on the agenda basically is, you know what, you're bringing up a good point. However, we're having this conversation right now. Can we put that on the agenda for next time? And some of the major things we also need to acknowledge is that we have a right to stop if we feel uncomfortable. Like, you know what, this conversation is not what needs to happen right now. You deserve to take a moment of silence. Kind of check yourself if you're feeling okay. And having one mic agreement of, you know, I talk, then you could talk. Also asking someone if you could ask a question helps to just kind of have a two-way conversation, and they could accept some responsibility in what they're saying and having to explain it to you. Do you see what I see is just a way of calling out that you also have a valid experience. So this challenges the person to just say, I hear what you're saying. Do you also hear that this was my experience? Let's talk about the subject is directly about tone policing. So yes, I might be passionate about something, but you're not listening to my content. You're listening to like my tone of voice. So just being able to like call them out on that and recenter yourself in the conversation. And what I hear you saying is just a really effective conversation tool in communication about reframing, or paraphrasing what somebody says. So what I hear you saying is did I get that right? So I understand that this does not cover all the conversations you might be having or specific concerns about a candidate or about a specific election, but I just want to take a moment to ground us on why this is important. Next slide, please. So, in the wisdom of Stacey Abrams, a vote is not a magic bullet, but it is a start. So I want everyone to understand that while we're trying to dig into these conversations and motivate people to get out and vote, we are not voting for superheroes, but we can hold people accountable with our people power. So I know there's moments when we're feeling disillusioned, we're feeling cynical, we might be feeling hopeless, but understanding that these tactics were created to make us tired, right? To subdue our voice. They're trying to take our power. So we have to be able to fight that and keep moving forward. And showing up for the work on the street is important, and it's another critical piece of the puzzle. So I need you all to understand that if we're out in these streets, we need to show up, and we need to show up for everyone. How can we ask folks to show up for us if we don't show up for them? At the same time, all these demonstrations without legislation will just leave us in stagnation. So if you take anything from today, know that demonstration without legislation is stagnation. We have to be able to vote, to push our policies, to see the world that we want to see move forward. So with that, I just want to bring back my colleagues, because we've been talking a lot, and just check in with everyone before we close up today.
That was amazing. I just keep thinking of, even within my own family, like I love my family, but it can be hard to have a conversation about politics sometimes. And that's just, we love each other, but of course we're different people. So we have different opinions about different things. And a little bit about me, I was a debater in high school and in college. And that has followed me since, because my parents have now decided that I just want to debate everything. I just want to talk and have conversations about everything. And it's the truth, I do. That's why I'm helping lead this training. But something that I learned to do is that, they were like, I was kind of annoyed, frankly, when they were saying that. But they were saying something to me, which is, Sonia, you talk and you don't listen. So that was something that I had to learn, is like, I, as a 16, 17-year-old, thought I was like the smartest Coca-Cola in the can, or whatever the saying is. I don't know.
I love that.
But I had to learn to ask questions. My parents would say something and I'd be like, like 16-year-old me would be like, parents. And then I'd be like, okay, like, let's think about the context. Let's think about where my parents are getting the source of information, and let me listen and ask questions.
Yeah, that listening part, I've been having a lot of conversations about even this training series and having effective conversations with some of the people in my family. And the biggest thing that I have had to combat is folks wanting to beat down people verbally who are not gung-ho about voting, who are not haven't already sent in their ballot, or who are, there's this tendency, especially in this environment, in this climate, to be like, how dare you not do this, right?
Mm-hmm.
But part of what we're trying to say in all of this is that in order to really reach people, you need to take yourself out of the equation and your little ego and listen to people and be empathetic and know what you know, but also raise up their experience and hear where they're coming from. That is the most important part of moving anybody to do anything, is really allowing them the space to be who they are.
Mm-hmm.
That's so powerful. I think we get so passionate sometimes that we can't look outside of that. And this is really a moment in time where we all just need to take a breath and be like, okay, am I speaking to be heard, or am I speaking to be understood? And I think that's a huge piece that we could just sit with, and to look towards our next training series on how we're actually voting and how that makes people feel and how we move forward is just super important.
Mm-hmm. And the last thing I'll say is, for the tenets, like, I don't want you going out to your friends and family being like, apply tenet 5 here. Like, don't do that. But it has been helpful for me to help other people guide them in their thought process. So when my parents, say whatever they say, or my sisters say whatever they say, and I'm like, let me think of how to help them envision why I think a certain way and why I want and hope for them to think the same way. And that's really helpful. So I center the margin. I take the person who's most affected by whatever policy, and then I walk them through that vision. So apply these tenets in your conversations.
All right. And with that, I want to take this time to say thank you to Kenia and to Sonia, who have walked us through this training, who has led us through this journey. It has been a journey tonight. For those of you who have been here with us, thank you for being journey with us. Thank you for opening and really being present with this information. This is a journey, and this is a different route that we have been taking to get out the vote. It is more than just like telling people to go vote. That ain't how you do it. You have to actually have some rigor behind these conversations. With that, we're done with tonight, but there are still things that you can do. Go to mobilizetowin.org for all the program needs that you have, to learn about this program that we're working on, to see these trainings that we have been doing, to access the resources that we have mentioned, to sign up for the training that is coming up in 2 weeks on September 13th, which is going to be the last of the 3 trainings, which is going to be mobilizing our people, getting out the vote, which is going to be the best one of these 3. Please, please, please go and utilize these resources. We are here to serve the movement and serve you. And that's why we go deep on these conversations. That's why we go granular with this. And so for all of you who stuck through it with us, thank you and congratulations to you, because like this is going to help all of us in the long run. And with that, I just want to say thank you. Thank you again. Y'all are the dopest people there. Again, there's a whole bunch of stuff happening in the world, but look, we still have work to do. So stay encouraged, stay vigilant, and we're going to see you on September 13th. Y'all have a good one.
Bye, everyone.
This is the moment we've been waiting for. Since the hours we gathered together on a night in November, painfully aware of the long fight ahead. Since the day we decided that we would not give in and grab the hand of our nearest neighbor and march to the streets. Since the moment millions joined the chorus to tell the world we would not stand for injustice against any one of us. We marched, we rallied, we fought, we steeled ourselves, and we rose up as corruption tore through the White House like a wildfire. We rose up as our country changed in ways that were unrecognizable, and we showed up for every single battle. While those at the top stoked the fires of division, each day Americans made the choice to come together. We are still in the streets, we are still fighting, knowing that what we fight for matters more than anything. And this is the moment we've been waiting for. This is our opportunity to reject the politics of hate, chaos, division, and change the course of history. This November, we have an opportunity to elect a leader who will join us as we build an America for all. The moment where we grab our family, our friends, and show up to change the world.